Galesburg, Illinois, October 1888. The prairie wind had a new edge to it, a promise of the iron-hard winter to come. On a small plot of leased land bordering the vast Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy rail yards, a man was engaged in an act of profound and public foolishness. His name was Cormac O'Donnell, and he was trying to build a house out of a train. Not one train car, which might have been eccentric, but three. A long, elegant, but faded Pullman parlor car, a sturdy 36-foot boxcar, and a bay window caboose lay in a dead straight line, their wheels removed, resting on a foundation of heavy timber crib work. O'Donnell, a man built more like a rivet than a hammer, was using a massive wrench to bolt the heavy steel draft gear plates of the cars directly to one another, turning three separate bodies into one rigid 84-foot spine of steel and wood. The work was slow, loud, and visible to every man in the yard. Eldridge Vance, the CB&Q's division traffic agent, stood with a knot of switchmen, his hands on his hips, and a look of weary disapproval on his face. Vance was a man who understood rules, timetables, and the orderly disposition of company property. O'Donnell's project offended all three. "It's a damn nuisance is what it is," Vance said, loud enough for O'Donnell to hear the remark carry on the wind. "He thinks he can just drag retired stock off the deadline and make a home? There are liens on that equipment." A yard foreman named Silas Croft spat a stream of tobacco juice. "More than that, it's crazy. A string of steel boxes in a prairie winter? He's building himself a tomb, Mr. Vance. A long, cold tomb for him and his." O'Donnell paused his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a greasy hand. He looked at the men, his gaze calm and steady, and offered no reply. He simply bent back to the massive bolt, the screech of metal on metal, his only answer. The men shook their heads. They'd already named it. O'Donnell's Folly. A long, skinny, ridiculous house that would surely kill his family before the spring thaw. What did this Irish car fitter from the Inchicore Railway Works in Cork understand about section thermal buffers that a respected division traffic agent and a lifetime of experienced railroad men had missed? The answer to that question would rewrite the rules of survival in the unforgiving Midwest. It would challenge the very definition of a home and prove that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes not from following the rules, but from knowing how to break and reassemble them. If you stick with us, I promise you will learn a fundamental principle of thermodynamics that can make any structure warmer and more efficient. So subscribe to this channel and let us know in the comments. What's the strangest, most ingenious makeshift shelter you've ever seen? Cormac O'Donnell was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, nor a frontiersman. He was a fitter, a man whose entire life had been spent with the heft of steel plates, the smell of hot rivets, and the precise tolerances of railway carriage construction. His hands, calloused and sure, knew the language of draft gear, coupling pins, and underframes. In the great Inchicore works back in Ireland, he had been a valued shop hand, known for his work on a peculiar task: bolting retired, worn-out rolling stock into rigid, multi-car composites. These were not for carrying passengers. They were sacrificial lambs. Brute force battering rams pushed ahead of the new steam-powered snow-rotary plows during brutal winter tests in the Wicklow Mountains. He learned how three weak bodies bolted into one could become a single, immovable object. That knowledge felt a world away during his family's first winter in Galesburg. He, his wife Siobhan, and their two small children, Finn and Bridget, had arrived with little more than their passage papers and the promise of work in the booming CB&Q shops. They rented a standard clapboard shanty, a box of thin pine and tar paper that was considered adequate housing by the standards of the day. It was not adequate. It was a sieve for heat, a trap for the cold. That first winter was a lesson in the physics of misery. Siobhan tried to apply a coat of stove polish one morning, only to watch the black paste dry to a gray powder on the brush. In mid-stroke, the moisture wicked away by the impossibly dry, cold air inside their own home. In the small root cellar, the cabbage stalks they'd stored for the winter didn't rot. They froze solid, then went limp, bending like lengths of cane soaked in salt water when a brief thaw came. The Sears and Roebuck catalog, their primary source of reading and dreaming, became a solid block on the bedside table. Its pages froze together in a clump that would not yield, its promises of a better life sealed in a tomb of ice. They burned through a mountain of wood, feeding the potbelly stove until it glowed a dull red, yet the corners of the room never rose above freezing. They lived in a small bubble of survivable warmth, 6 feet in diameter, while a killing cold laid siege just beyond its perimeter. Cormac watched his children, their faces pale, their breath pluming in the air as they huddled near the stove. He was a man who built things to withstand immense force and brutal conditions. Yet he was living in a paper box that was failing his family. He looked out the frosted window at the rail yard, at the long lines of retired rolling stock sitting silent on the sidings, cars deemed unfit for service, waiting to be scrapped or reclaimed. He saw not junk, but components. He saw not decay, but potential. He saw the ghosts of the snowplow pushers from Inchicore. An idea began to form, an idea born of desperation and deep, practical knowledge, an idea that everyone else would call madness. The failure of the conventional frontier cabin was not a mystery. It was a simple, brutal calculation of heat loss. A standard shanty built with single-layer pine planks and perhaps a layer of tar paper had an insulating value, or R value, of barely R2. It was functionally transparent to the cold. The enemy was threefold: conduction, convection, and infiltration. Heat conducted directly through the thin wooden walls, flowing from the warm interior to the freezing exterior as easily as water through a screen. Inside, the air itself became a traitor. Warmed by the stove, it would rise to the ceiling, travel to the cold outer walls, cool, and then sink back to the floor, creating a constant, chilling, circulatory current, a convection loop that made the floor an ice rink and the air near the ceiling scorching hot. And then there was infiltration, the 1,000 tiny gaps in the construction through which the prairie wind forced its way in, a relentless assault of super-chilled air that defeated the stove's best efforts. For families like the Crofts, who lived 2 doors down from the O'Donnells' first shanty, winter was a state of constant, exhausting battle. Silas Croft spent most of his waking hours cutting, splitting, and hauling wood. His wife, Martha, spent hers stuffing rags into window cracks and trying to keep a kettle from freezing solid on the back of the stove. Their reality was one of ice crystals forming on the heads of nails inside their own walls, of blankets that felt damp and cold even by the fire. They burned through 4 cords of oak by January, an immense expenditure of labor and money, just to keep the temperature inside their home from dropping into the single digits. They weren't living. They were surviving, minute by grueling minute. The problem wasn't their stove or their wood. The problem was the house itself. It was an engine designed for maximum heat loss. Cormac understood this in his bones. He knew that fighting a Midwest winter with a single thin wall was like trying to stop a freight train with a wooden fence. You didn't need a stronger wall. You needed a different strategy altogether. You needed buffers. You needed stages. You needed to slow the enemy down, to make it fight for every degree of temperature, for every inch of ground. You needed to build not a wall, but a gradient. The construction of O'Donnell's Folly was a spectacle that provided daily entertainment for the men of the Galesburg Yard. It began in late September, with Cormac painstakingly laying out a foundation of heavy oak timbers salvaged from a dismantled trestle bridge. This crib work raised the structure 2 feet off the ground, a crucial defense against snowdrifts and frozen earth. Then came the cars. With the help of a borrowed team of horses and a series of levers and rollers, he coaxed the 3 hulks from the deadline siding onto his plot. First, the Pullman parlor car, its faded green paint and elegant curved windows a reminder of a grander past. This would be their living space. Next, the 36-foot boxcar, a simple windowless crate of thick wood and steel bracing. This was the heart of his idea. Finally, the bay window caboose, a compact and practical space that would serve as their kitchen and mudroom. The real work, the work that drew the most scorn, was joining them. "You can't just bolt a train together, O'Donnell," scoffed Jedediah Potts, a car inspector with 20 years of experience. "They're meant to couple, to have slack and play. You make that string rigid, the first hard frost will heave your foundation and snap it in two." Cormac just nodded. "The frost can try," he said quietly, and continued tightening the massive nuts, torquing them down until the steel plates of the 3 cars were fused into a single, unyielding unit. He wasn't building a train. He was building a spine. Eldridge Vance paid him a formal visit one afternoon, holding a clipboard. "O'Donnell," he began, his tone official, "I have to inform you that this constitutes an unauthorized use and modification of company property. These cars are subject to the retired equipment lien of 1887. The CB&Q retains the right to reclaim this stock for scrap at any time. I can't guarantee this structure will still be here come April." Cormac looked up from the frame of a canvas gangway he was building to connect the Pullman and the caboose. "It only needs to be here till April, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice devoid of defiance. It was a simple statement of fact. Siobhan watched from the doorway of their miserable shanty, her heart a knot of fear and faith. "Are you sure about this, Cormac?" she'd asked one night, the wind rattling their single window pane. "A house of train cars? The children?" He took her hand. "Siobhan, a railway car is built to keep paying passengers comfortable at 60 miles an hour through a blizzard. This shanty can't keep us warm when the wind is still. Which do you trust more?" He wasn't arrogant. He was a man who trusted the integrity of a well-built thing. He sealed the gaps between the cars with tar and oakum, then built heavy canvas and wood gangways to connect the interiors, creating a single, continuous living space. He installed a single efficient potbelly stove in the Pullman parlor car, running the stovepipe up and across the ceiling, then through the boxcar and caboose, finally venting it through the caboose's cupola. This long run of pipe would radiate heat into all 3 sections before exiting, wringing every possible British thermal unit, or BTU, from each piece of wood. The mockery lasted all autumn. The validation would have to wait for the cold. The genius of Cormac O'Donnell's design was not in any single component, but in the system they created together. He had intuitively grasped a core principle of thermodynamics. It is far more efficient to defeat an enemy in stages than to fight it on a single front. His train house was not one home. It was 3 distinct thermal envelopes nested together. The problem wasn't just keeping one room warm. The problem was managing the flow of heat across multiple boundaries. Let's talk numbers. A single BTU, or British thermal unit, is the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. A cord of dry oak contains about 29 million BTUs. The Croft family, in their conventional shanty, was burning through those millions of BTUs at a ferocious rate, because the temperature difference their stove had to fight was enormous. If it was 70 degrees inside and 20 degrees outside, that was a 90-degree differential, or temperature gradient, across a single, thin wall with an R value of 2. The heat fled through that wall, as if it were an open door. Now consider Cormac's system. The Pullman car, with its double-walled construction, insulated floor, and smaller windows, was the primary living space, with an R value of around R8. This was their 70-degree sanctuary. But its walls weren't fighting a 20-degree enemy. They were connected by a canvas gangway to the Caboose, which acted as the second envelope. The Caboose, with its own stove for cooking and the heat radiating from the long stovepipe, might stabilize at a cool but manageable 40 degrees. It had an R value of about R6. So the Pullman's wall was only fighting a 30-degree temperature difference, 70 degrees to 40 degrees. The heat loss was dramatically reduced, but the real secret weapon was the boxcar. It was the middle section, unheated, and used for storage and as a workshop. It was a massive 36-foot-long buffer of trapped, still air. Its thick wooden walls had an R value of about R4. The Caboose, at 40 degrees, shared a boundary with this unheated boxcar. The temperature inside the boxcar might drop to 10 degrees, but it was still 30 degrees warmer than the outside air. The Caboose walls, therefore, were also only fighting a 30-degree differential. Finally, the vast outer wall of the boxcar was the only part of the system that faced the full fury of the 20-degree winter. But the heat had already been stepped down twice. The heat energy from the stove in the Pullman had to travel through the Pullman wall, across the Caboose, through the Caboose wall, across the boxcar, and finally through the boxcar wall to escape. Each boundary, each air gap, acted as a baffle, slowing the transfer of heat to a crawl. Cormac had effectively halved the heat loss at each stage. He wasn't just building a home, he was building a thermal cascade, a gentle slope for heat to descend rather than a cliff for it to fall off. The prairie didn't reward brute force. It rewarded what worked. That winter, the prairie decided to test what worked. In mid-January, a weather system descended on the Mississippi Valley that the old-timers would talk about for decades. They called it the Great Siege. For 18 consecutive days, the temperature in Galesburg never rose above 20 degrees Fahrenheit, bottoming out at 24. With the cold came two separate ground blizzards, storms that didn't drop new snow but picked up the existing fall and hurled it sideways with hurricane-force winds. The world became a horizontal blur of white. Snow driven with the force of sand, scoured paint from buildings, and piled into drifts that buried fences and reached the eaves of the shanties. For the citizens of Galesburg, it was a catastrophe. The rail yard ground to a halt, switches froze, couplings seized, and steel rails turned brittle as glass. In the town's flimsy houses, the siege was a brutal personal war. The Croft family ran out of firewood on the 10th day. Silas, his face masked in ice, tried to make it to his woodpile 50 feet from his door and was forced back by the wind, his lungs aching from the sheer cold of the air. They started burning furniture. Inside the long, strange house on the edge of the yard, a different reality prevailed. The wind howled and screamed against the steel and wood of the boxcar, but inside the Pullman parlor, the sound was a distant, muffled roar. The triple-layer defense was not just a thermal barrier, it was an acoustic one. The single stove, fed a steady, economical diet of oak and coal, kept the parlor at a comfortable 68 degrees. The long stovepipe running through the Caboose kept the kitchen area warm enough that water in the bucket by the door never developed so much as a skim of ice. The boxcar was frigid, but it was a still, dry cold, a perfect larder where their winter provisions hung safe and frozen. This was where the innovation revealed its true power, not in numbers on a page, but in the quiet rhythms of domestic life. One afternoon, during the worst of the blizzard, Bridget, age 5, sat on the floor in her shirt sleeves, carefully cutting figures from a newspaper. Siobhan, sitting in a padded Pullman chair, was mending one of Finn's shirts, her fingers nimble and warm. The air was still. There were no drafts. On the small table beside her, sat a simple brown teapot, a wedding gift from her mother. It was filled with the strong black tea Cormac loved. It sent a steady, fragrant plume of steam into the warm air. That teapot, unassuming and mundane, was the ultimate proof. It had been sitting there since supper, nearly 4 hours ago. The tea inside was still hot enough to scald a man's tongue. In every other house in their neighborhood, tea left for 10 minutes became a lukewarm disappointment. A pot left for an hour was a kettle of brown ice that had to be broken up with a fork. Cormac O'Donnell had not just built a shelter, he had defeated winter so completely that the small, civilized comforts of a normal life could proceed, uninterrupted. The breaking point for the railroad came on the 14th night of the siege. A priority freight train, hauling mining equipment west, derailed in the middle of the Galesburg yard. A drawbar coupling, its steel contracted by the extreme cold, had snapped under strain. 3 flat cars had jumped the tracks, blocking the main line. Eldridge Vance was called out at 3 a.m. The air was a physical assault, so cold it felt like breathing in powdered glass. He and a small, shivering yard crew fought their way through the waist-deep drifts, their lanterns casting feeble, swirling circles of light in the blowing snow. The work was brutal and dangerous. Metal tools stuck to bare skin. Men's words froze in their throats. After an hour of fruitless struggle with the frozen wreckage, Vance sent a man back to the roundhouse for heavier chains. He stood for a moment, turning his back to the wind, trying to regain the feeling in his face. His route back to the yard office took him along the siding where O'Donnell's Folly stood. Through the maelstrom, he saw something that stopped him dead. It was a light, a soft, warm, amber glow. It wasn't a window. It was the canvas of the gangway connecting the caboose to the main car, illuminated from within, pulsing gently like a living throat. Above the snow-plastered roofs of the 3 cars, he saw not one but 3 distinct, clean threads of white smoke rising from the single stovepipe vent. They went straight up, unwavering, into the violent swirling air, the sign of a clean, efficient, and unhurried fire, not the belching black smoke of a stove being desperately overfed. The structure was a ship of warmth and stillness in an ocean of frozen chaos. It looked impossible. It looked serene. Drawn by a force he didn't understand, Vance trudged through the deep drift toward the caboose door. He expected to feel the biting cold radiating from the structure, the way it did from every other building in town. He expected to see frost an inch thick on the door. He felt and saw neither. As he got closer, he could feel a faint, almost imperceptible aura of stability. There was no sound of rattling windows or whistling drafts, only the deep hum of the wind passing over a solid object. He raised a gloved hand and knocked. The door opened, and Cormac O'Donnell stood there, silhouetted against the warm light. Vance braced himself for the blast of frigid air that always accompanied an opened door in winter. It never came. Instead, a gentle, silent wave of perfectly still, dry, warm air washed over him. It didn't feel like stove heat. It wasn't the scorching, arid heat of a fire pushed to its limit. It was just warmth, stable, deep. Vance stood there speechless, the snow melting on his eyebrows. He lowered his gaze from Cormac's face into the room. He saw the kitchen space clean and orderly. He saw through the next gangway into the lamplit parlor, where a child's paper dolls lay on a rug. The vindication was not an argument. It was a physical sensation. It was the feeling of warmth, where his entire life's experience told him there should only be killing cold. His palm, which he had rested on the doorframe, felt the smooth, dry wood. It was cool, but not cold. It wasn't stealing his life's heat. "My God, O'Donnell," Vance whispered, his voice hoarse. "How?" Cormac just looked at him. "It's a long box," he said simply. "The cold has a long walk to get to the family." Vance stared past him, at the quiet domestic scene inside. He finally understood. Cormac hadn't built a flimsy wall to punch back the cold. He had built a series of chambers that bled the cold of its strength. You didn't build a house, you built a lung. The story of that night spread faster than a spring thaw. Eldridge Vance, the officious agent, the man of rules, became Cormac's most powerful advocate. The talk of liens and reclamation vanished. Instead, Vance began directing men from the Brotherhood of Railway Carmen, Local 287, to O'Donnell's plot. "Go see what the Irishman has done," he'd say, "and take notes." Cormac, who had never argued with his critics, now shared his knowledge freely with anyone who asked. He didn't have blueprints, but he would walk men through the structure, explaining the principles in simple, practical terms. He spoke of the boxcar as the winter's front porch, a space you gave to the cold, so it would leave your parlor alone. He explained how the single, long stovepipe was like a river, depositing its warmth along its entire length before vanishing into the sky. The idea, so radical and foolish in the autumn, became gospel by the spring. The Knights of Labor reading rooms, hubs of working-class intellectual life, became centers for disseminating the design. Men sketched out variations on slates and the backs of shipping manifests. By the end of 1889, 9 more dwellings built from retired rolling stock had risen on leased land along the Burlington line, each one a testament to Cormac's quiet genius. They were warmer, cheaper, and faster to build than any shanty, and they were saving families. The mockery had lasted a season. The validation would last for generations. It is easy to dismiss such an invention as a relic of a bygone era, a curiosity of the frontier. But the principles Cormac O'Donnell mastered by instinct and experience are the very same ones that drive modern building science today. His sectioned thermal buffer is the direct ancestor of modern double-wall construction, where a significant air gap is intentionally left between interior and exterior walls to halt thermal bridging. His focus on creating a continuous, unbroken envelope is the core concept behind today's obsession with airtightness and thermal envelopes. When architects today talk about creating warm side and cold side barriers, or designing homes with unheated buffer zones like attached garages or 3-season porches to protect the primary living space, they are speaking the same language Cormac spoke with steel and wood. He had, with no formal training, stumbled upon a truth that engineers would spend the next century proving with complex calculations. The most elegant solutions are often about managing energy, not just resisting it. Cormac O'Donnell never sought fame or credit. He was a practical man solving a practical problem: the survival of his family. But in doing so, he left behind a lesson that transcends mere construction. He looked at objects the world had declared finished, useless, and at the end of their lives. He saw not junk, but a vocabulary. He saw the potential for a new kind of grammar, a new way of assembling old words into a sentence that could speak powerfully against the cold. The true elegance of his solution was its empathy. He understood that you could not defeat a prairie winter through sheer force. It was too vast, too powerful. You had to accommodate it, to negotiate with it. You had to give it a room of its own. He didn't build one house against the cold. He taught 3 retired bodies to lie down together and share one warmth, creating a whole far greater and more resilient than the sum of its forgotten parts. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and survival as fascinating as we did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more tales of forgotten innovators. And we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What modern technology do you think owes a debt to this kind of simple, practical frontier thinking? The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by real historical practices and engineering principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional. Any application of historical techniques to modern construction should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.